Exploring new code bases. It's a tough topic, and it's not something that we exercise a lot of the times. And when we do, it's usually in a high-pressure environment, like for example, when you've just switched to a new job and everybody's looking at you to see how fast you can get up and running. Or when you're just joining a new team within the same company, but still everybody's looking at you to see how fast you can get up and running. My name is Donny Walls, and in this video, I would like to show you 5 tips that can help you get better at exploring new code bases and also showing your progress while you're doing this, because that can be just as important as getting up to speed. So the first tip that I have for you is meeting the team. If you're joining a new team and you're working on a new code base, there's people that wrote that code before you got there. And it can be really tempting to race through your onboarding calls and start reading the code and getting your hands dirty to make sure that everybody sees how productive you are. But it can be really helpful to understand who wrote some of the code, why they did it, and why the code is in the state that it's in. It's also just a nice way to kind of have some banter with people that you work with. For example, when I joined Disney about 7 years ago, I saw some Swiftland comments in the code, and at that point, I hardly had any idea what Swiftland did. I'd heard of it before, and I knew that it was a linter that helped your code maintain a consistent style and all of that, but seeing a comment that disabled a Swiftland rule for some specific scenarios, I just wasn't sure what to make of it, and I could have pasted that code into Google, but instead I decided to hop on a call with my senior engineer or my team lead, and I asked him, like, what's the reason that things are set up this way? Why are these rules enabled or disabled at the point where they are needed? And why is this on demand? Why is this not done all the time? Why couldn't this code be changed, etc., etc.? And I actually learned a lot about code generation, and the team lead explained to me that some of the places where we had to turn off Swiftland were for generated code, where we really didn't care what that code looked like because it was all generated by a computer anyway. And I wouldn't have learned all that as quickly and as nicely if I hadn't asked the question. So that's just one example where asking the question really taught me a lot more than I was actually asking about. And of course, I didn't go in and say, okay, tell me what this line does, because I knew that I could have just Googled that. Instead, I literally asked, like, can you tell me a little bit about why things are the way they are and what this setup means and whether that's common practice or if this is some exception and all of that. Another story I have is more recent, where I joined a team temporarily as a contractor, and I was supposed to work on a very old code base. And that code base had some Objective-C in there, several architectural patterns, and it really was a little bit all over the place. And all the engineers working on the code agreed with me. It would have been really easy to go in and say, well, this code's a mess, we need to rework all of it. But instead, I chose to talk to all the people on the team. And after learning what had happened, I figured that a lot of people had left the team and a lot of people had in-progress refactors that really, there wasn't that much time for these refactorings. So a lot of them were kind of left up in the air. And again, understanding why the code was the way it is really helped me work around the rough edges and focus on what mattered rather than getting hung up on some of the not so great remnants of the past. So knowing who wrote the code and why they did that really helps with establishing an understanding of why the code is the way it is. And that is absolutely crucial. And also knowing who wrote the code, it just feels nicer when you kind of have a sense of the personalities behind the code. The second tip I have for you is, let's go and break some things, right? It's really good to understand why some things work, and we can look at code and kind of figure out, what does this code do? Why does it work? Why would it break? And all of these things. If there's unit tests, that's even better. But if you can understand how things break and why, that can be really useful. For example, if you start messing around the network layer and for some reason certain things aren't breaking the way you expected, maybe there's a local cache in between that you hadn't thought of. And this is not as important, I would say, as really understanding why the code is the way it is. But it can be really fun to explore a code base simply by breaking stuff instead of just reading code and trying to understand why it's written the way it is without knowing the team or without knowing how it breaks. And in a way, it's sometimes easier to figure out why something broke than to figure out why it worked in the first place, right? If we break something on purpose and we know that something broke because of that, you now know something about the code base. Sometimes it's something obvious, like if you point to an URL that doesn't exist inside of a network layer, you're going to get 404 responses. But seeing how the app handles those can be extremely valuable. So I always like to go in and break a couple things to see what happens and if that all makes sense to me, and I'll kind of take it from there. The third tip I have from you is to start focusing on a small scope. And this kind of ties into breaking stuff. Because if you join a huge code base, you're going to be overwhelmed, and it will be impossible for any single team member to know everything about all of the code in the project. So it makes a lot of sense to just focus on something tiny. If you're part of a team that works on a specific part of an app, focus on that bit. If you're going to be sort of all over the place and working on many things, still try and find one or two features that you care about or that you think are interesting to you, and start digging into those. And because one team member isn't going to know everything about all of the code base, if you've already met the team, you know who to look for to ask certain questions, and that's going to be really helpful too. Now, what's also interesting is that even if a code base is a little bit messy or unstructured, you'll find that if you understand one feature really well, that a similar thought pattern or thought process will be applied through the rest of the code. Sometimes it's really obvious when there's a rigid architecture in place, but other times it won't be as obvious, but there's still going to be some sort of overarching philosophy, even if it's not written down in some wiki or some documents. And of course, if you're going to be working on a certain part of the app, focus on that first. If you're not going to be working on a specific part of the app, find something that you think could be interesting. And maybe there's some tickets waiting for you already as well. That could be great starting points too. Or if there's a crash that you're looking to resolve, that could also be your small scope. But focus on that first. Don't try to read all of the code in like a week or two, because that's just not going to be the best use of your time, in my experience at least. The fourth tip I have for you, leverage pair programming. Pair programming, in my opinion, is a vastly underused tool in almost every company that I've worked with. It can be especially useful in the onboarding phase if you can pair up with 1, 2, maybe 3 coworkers over the course of maybe 1, 2, 3 weeks and see them work and also contribute to their work a little bit. Because if you see your coworkers work, you'll often learn about processes, tools, or any other like company culture like things that they do. And those will allow you to adopt them quicker as well. And you can also ask questions like, hey, why are you writing your commit messages like that? Maybe they're prefixing them with words like fix or feat or those kinds of things. And maybe there's some changelog generator that you hadn't been told about yet, and now your coworker can tell you about that because you saw the way they commit. Or maybe they have some build steps that they run manually that you didn't know about, or all of these kinds of things. It can be really important to see them being executed by these people. And maybe your coworkers also have some shortcuts that they've figured out that work really well for them, or some other resources that they use a lot that are so ingrained in the way they work that they don't even think about them anymore. But seeing somebody else work can expose these things to you, and you're now able to ask questions about it and learn about it while also learning about the code base, while also learning about what matters. And it's really just I love pair programming as a means to get myself into a new code base. Even if I'm just observing for a couple of hours, that can be so helpful, especially when I'm also able to ask questions and maybe do a little bit of work on the side along with my new coworker. So that's pair programming. I think it's underused and really an important tool for anybody that's exploring something new. And my fifth tip, and the last one for this video, is use breakpoints. Right? Breakpoints allow you to suspend or pause execution of a program at points that you think are interesting. First, you can actually see that the code runs when you expect it to run, which can be really useful. But also, as soon as your breakpoint triggers and your program is now paused, you can see the call stack. Why did this function get called? What's this app doing on the side? What happens after this? What does this function call? And you could inspect properties, variables, and any other underlying data on the stack frame that you're looking at. So that can be extremely helpful if you're trying to understand more about the flow of the code and how things work. I do think breakpoints are maybe a little bit more advanced and techy than the other tips that I've given so far, because they all really come down to talking to humans and kind of messing around with the code and talking to more humans, right? Breakpoints are really sort of your tool that's very technology focused, that allows you to actually inspect the way the program works. I could augment the breakpoint tip, by the way, with something like instruments, a time profiler, these kinds of things, because they all allow you to inspect what's going on under the hood. All right, so in summary, the tips that I have for you are meet the team, break things, narrow your focus on something very small, maybe a feature you're going to be working on, maybe a crash, something like that. Also, use pair programming, get to know the people again, see how they work, ask tons of questions, become familiar with processes, tools, and sort of these cultural things that are not necessarily written down anywhere. And lastly, use breakpoints because they allow you to inspect the program in great detail. With that, I'd like to pass this question off to you. What are your favorite techniques for debugging and getting to know code bases and all of these things? Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.